Hello, everybody, and welcome to my very first Revamble. Today, we're going to review Consortium and how it may herald the death of mid-tier Kickstarters in video gaming.
Consortium, as described on their store page, is a story-driven, first-person role-playing experience. It was successfully funded on Kickstarter and successfully released.
So why might that mean the death of the mid-tier Kickstarter? We'll get to that in a bit.
First, how was the game? For the most part, I feel Consortium is successful in what it sets out to accomplish. It is a highly ambitious game in both plot and scope. But it does have its weaknesses as well. The plot of Consortium is both its biggest strength and its main weakness. You are a bishop, essentially the military arm of a worldwide peacekeeping force, and you are aboard the massive airship Zenlo, trying to solve a murder mystery while also trying to not get it blown apart.
Except you're not.
The reality is you're playing a game which accesses satellites to beam you into the future, into the body of another human being, who is a bishop aboard Zenlo.
Makes perfect sense. Right?
This plot point causes a strange disconnect between the characters and yourself. The thing is, I'm still undecided if this is brilliant or a huge mistake. It's certainly intentional, as a lot of your dialogue can reference this fact, which in turn freaks out your crewmates. And this is perhaps the thing the game's best at. Your dialogue choices have lasting consequences in the story and how the characters react to you.
So that's the basics of the plot. A believable world in an unbelievable situation with excellent characterization and voice acting.
Not to mention pages and pages of lore, which, to be honest, I didn't read.
What about the actual gameplay?
Let's just say the less said about the combat, the better. Fortunately, it is easy to completely avoid. The minigames and some of the missions are complete time wasters as well. But overall, they're not really what Consortium is about. And I have every confidence these will be resolved in the next game.
If there is a next game, which brings us to our Ramble, the death of Kickstarter.
Consortium is a wildly ambitious game made by a small team who clearly love the universe they created. Unlike a large number of Kickstarters, they delivered on their promises.
They did release the game in a buggy state, but then they worked tirelessly to correct that, and as far as I can tell, they did.
However, despite all this, their Kickstarter for a sequel failed.
They did ask for more money this time, but with a proven track record and a wildly ambitious game, it should have been a Kickstarter hit. Why wasn't it?
My theory is people don't look to Kickstarter for this type of thing anymore. The very foundation on which it was started. And not without reason. Everyone familiar with Kickstarter knows the big failures. This is obviously going to hurt trust, with people becoming embittered about the process. I'm not going to linger on these, as I'm not here to state the obvious.
No, in my opinion, what's hurting Consortium and other games like it are the successes. What's hurting Consortium and other games like it are the successes. What an odd thing to say. The thing I've noticed as someone who observes Kickstarter on a regular basis and follows a bunch of these games and definitely took note of the ones that have failed is that they never stood up to the sanity check. If you look at these games objectively, such as the Yogscast game or Clang, they were mostly hype and momentum, but when you peel back the layers, obviously the people who were behind it were not quite as trustworthy or prepared for this type of thing as you would have thought based off of the presentation of their backer. They actually have the opposite problem of games like Consortium. They don't have the project management or the capacity to fulfill their obligations, but they have great marketing, great names behind them. They didn't have a solid foundation. That's why I don't think they're really comparable. I don't think they're exact opposites in a lot of ways, and I think you can kind of recognize that when you look at them. Not to suggest that this doesn't affect the amount of people looking at the Kickstarter site in general. That's definitely the case. But of the people who do visit the site, which there are still plenty, because there are still plenty of projects making a ton of money through Kickstarter funding. Looking through the Kickstarter website at some of the most funded games, we see some really recent ones such as Shenmue 3, Bloodstained, Mighty Number 9, to name a few. Which leads me to my point. What do all three of these games have in common? Shenmue 3 is a sequel to a game that was released over a decade ago. A great game, but a sequel to a game released over a decade ago. Bloodstained is, and I quote, a Metroidvania-style game from the former director of Castlevania, which, as far as the Metroidvania roots go, is based off of something over a decade ago, for sure. And Mighty Number 9, based on the Mega Man franchise, which started almost 3 decades ago. All three of these games seem to have mostly succeeded based on nostalgia, and I say that because I don't think there's a whole lot of people who have never played, so I don't think there's many people who have never played Mega Man that went and funded Mighty Number 9, at least not at the higher levels. They might have funded at the basic levels, but these games were massively overfunded because people poured tons of their own cash to see this happen. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Shenmue 3, I loved Shenmue. I fucking love that game, and I'm really excited for that. I didn't personally back it because I knew it would get backed. And my new Kickstarter stance is I will only back games that I don't think will get backed and I want to see. Looking through a spreadsheet I created using a Wikipedia article that had all the successful crowdfunding campaigns, which I will definitely drop a link into the description of this video, I created a spreadsheet so that I could easily filter and compare how these campaigns went instead of just going to them page by page. So once I filtered down to what I consider mid-tier Kickstarter campaigns from 2012 to the present, I found some really interesting stats that I'm going to share with you. In 2012, there was a total of 24 mid-tier Kickstarter campaigns. And when I say mid-tier, I'm referring to anything that asked for, not that they got, but that they asked for at least $200,000 to $700,000, because that seemed to be right in the middle. So there was 24 of those in 2012, and this is right on the Kickstarter boom. Double Fine Adventure was funded, I believe, in January. They're kind of the ones who made people realize that they could ask for more than $50,000 on Kickstarter and potentially fund their entire game, which is, I believe, where this bracket starts, around $200,000, where you could potentially fund a video game from start to finish without any outside money. So of the 24 campaigns in 2012, only 5 of them failed. That's sort of an insane number if you think about it. Only 5 mid-tier Kickstarter failed. This isn't a trivial sum of money. That's crazy. And it's certainly not a ratio I expect a site to be able to maintain. I'm not saying because we're not funding 19 out of 24 every year in this tier that Kickstarter's failing. Certainly not. That's not the point I'm making here. The other stat I kind of put together for you here is that of the successful campaigns, which there was 19 of, that were not heavily based on nostalgia or from an established brand/developer, there were 3. So of those 19, only 3 of them were not heavily based on nostalgia, like we've gone over with Shenmue 2, Mighty Number 9, or from an established brand/developer, which I would consider things like Wasteland 2, which we will see in coming years from inXile, Obsidian Entertainment. Those type of things I'm not counting in the stat for reasons I'll get to shortly. And I'm going to make sure to give you a visual of each of these years of games that I counted as nostalgia, etc. Because it is very heavily opinion-based. I kind of tried to... I mean, obviously an established brand/developer is not opinion-based. Obsidian is obviously a well-established developer. As you'll see, if it's based off a board game, that's obviously a very established brand. A successful board game, I should say. The nostalgia one's going to be the one that's kind of iffy, and I sort of base that around if it's sort of a genre that kind of died off in the 90s and is being revived back through Kickstarter because publishers won't fund them. That's what I'm counting as nostalgia. And I'm glad to see them there, but they're not the stat that's important to the point I'm making. So with that explanation in place, let's move on to 2013. In 2013, there were 18 mid-tier Kickstarter campaigns. It's less than 2012, but that's to be expected. This is much closer to the number I would expect in a year, maybe even less than that. Maybe around 15 would be sort of a healthy number. Of those 18, 6 failed. Again, that ratio is worse than last year, but that's to be expected. There's only so much money to go around, right? So we can kind of expect this after, because 2012 was definitely the spike year, so we should definitely be seeing some trending down. But my entire theory behind this ramble is not necessarily that we will see the percentage of failed campaigns go up, it's that we will see the percentage of truly unique games go down. So let's look at that now. Of the 12 campaigns which succeeded, I found that 4 of those are games that I consider to be truly unique that are not from an established brand or developer. That makes my theory seem pretty weak, doesn't it? That was actually an increase over 2012 of the percentage of successful games that were truly unique. That's a really good ratio, and actually that's exactly dead on what I would hope. Not what I would hope, but what I would expect to happen. People are still going to go with safe bets, right? Which only makes sense. So let's move on to 2014 and see what happens. In 2013, there were 18 campaigns, but in 2014, there were only 9. Wow, that's not at all what I would expect, considering the successful percentage of these mid-tier Kickstarter campaigns. It seems that one of two things happened. Either there just wasn't games out there that needed Kickstarter campaigns to be funded, or they decided that a mid-tier campaign was not really the answer for them. Either they were an established developer that had seen success the previous year, maybe they realized they could ask for more money, a more realistic sum for a bigger developer, and then the more unique games realized, hey, maybe I should ask for less because it has a bigger chance to succeed, which is a huge problem with Kickstarter, and I'll get into that subject once we get through this data. So there were 9 campaigns, 4 failed, which means there were only 5 of the 9 that succeeded. A huge, huge drop, which is basically saying that if indeed the developers realized this was not the place for them, and that's why there was only 9, they were dead on 100% correct, and I would like to ask those people some financial advice. But again, this is just one year. It could totally be an outlier. Maybe 2014 was just a bad year overall. Of those 5 that succeeded, 2 were what I consider to be truly unique games. That's actually almost dead on the same percentage as last year, just with substantially less games. So in fact, if we just take these 3 years into consideration, you could overall argue that mid-tier Kickstarter campaigns in general are just dead. But I don't think that's what we're seeing. If we go on to 2015, there were 10 campaigns, which I guess we're seeing that to be the plateau of Kickstarter. The 10 number instead of the 15 number I would have guessed. Of those 10, only 1 failed, which is completely counter to the previous year where we would have thought that mid-tier Kickstarters are just completely dying out in general. But instead what we see here is that of the 9 that succeeded, 0 were what I consider to be truly unique games. 0. In fact, the only Kickstarter that failed in this price range that year would have been the only game that fell into that category. With that in mind, what conclusions can we draw? I would really love to have a couple more years data on this, but with Kickstarter being relatively new, this is all just a bunch of guesses, which works for me for now because this is just a ramble. What this says to me is that small developers who don't think they can pull in this amount of money, despite it being the actual amount that they need, realistically speaking, they will most likely try to ask for less than they need. And I think that this range, and this is why I picked this range, and this was why I kind of view it as so important, I think this range is the perfect range for these type of games. If they could actually pull in that amount of money, I truly believe it's the amount of money that they'll need. So these games asking for $80,000, they're kind of hoping that nothing's going to go wrong. And that's not always the case. You do have games being funded by people all over the world, and a lot of places a number of places have a lower cost of living than, like, San Francisco, California, so they can make a game much cheaper than your typical developer can make. And that's really awesome. I think it's really cool that you can buy a game made by someone who lives on the other side of the world of you, and it could be a really good game. They can make a lot of money off of it for really cheap. That's awesome. Darkest Dungeon is a game that's been recently released to great reviews. Everyone seems to love it. It's been very successful. It's a very unique game and very difficult, not something you would typically find being funded by publishers. So Kickstarter was the perfect place for it. However, they asked for $75,000. That was their campaign target. And how Kickstarter works is if you don't hit that amount, you don't get the money. So if they had hit $74,999, their Kickstarter would have failed and they would have seen none of that money. Looking at Darkest Dungeon, do you think that that game took $75,000 to make? Absolutely not. In fact, they ended up getting over $300,000 for this game. And not only that, but they went to early access where other people could purchase the game for a long period of time. I don't quite know. It looks like it was funded in March 2014. We have to assume it spent a lot of 2015 in early access. So you could argue $300,000 wasn't even enough for them to be funded completely. Do you think this game, which no one had heard of from a developer, no one had heard of, came on Kickstarter, asked for, let's just say $200,000. They would have never made it. And this is one of the huge issues with Kickstarter. Basically, Kickstarter is all about momentum. If you don't hit a reasonable percentage of your target within a short period of time, let's say your Kickstarter is 2 weeks, if you don't hit a good percent of your target within a few days, people are going to be like, oh, this Kickstarter is never going to hit this target, let's not even bother. Which makes no sense because you only get money taken out of your account if they're successful. So there's no reason to not support a failing Kickstarter. But that's just not how your brain works, even if it's something you'd really enjoy. So if I were a game developer that priced the amount I needed to make my game at, let's just say $80,000. I'm making a single person game. I'm going to develop it, design all the graphics. I need $80,000 to survive so I can make this game and put it out within a reasonable time frame. I'm going to seriously consider at least halving that amount to set as my campaign target, because no one goes into this thinking their idea is not brilliant. So you just want to get the momentum. People are going to see 40,000. They're going to be like, oh, he just needs 40,000. All right, that makes sense. We can probably hit that. I'll donate some. You hit 40,000. Then comes the stretch goals. So you successfully hit 40,000, but you need 40,000 more to actually hit your true hidden goal. To get that, you have to promise. You basically have to lure people in despite the fact that you've hit your goal. How you do that is you hold stuff back, which isn't even necessarily stuff that you can hold back, but you will do so. It's a fantasy game, so we have a bunch of races and classes and jobs. So let's say, all right, what's something I can really cheaply add in that will add some variety for players and appeal to a certain demographic of people that they'll really, really want it? All right, let's say, this race of lizardmen I was going to include in the game. Let's just take them out and say, all right, it's a stretch goal now. I have to hit 50,000 to include lizardmen. Someone will see that and be like, all right, this game's already succeeded. He priced it at $40,000. It's already hit that. That means there's a reasonable chance this game will get made. I could, bide my time and wait until it comes out and buy it then. However, I really, really like lizardmen. And if we hit 50,000, he's going to include lizardmen in this game. So, despite the safe thing being waiting and seeing if this guy actually completes this game, I'm going to toss him some money, and because I really want my lizardmen, and see what happens. And so, you hit 50,000, you include lizardmen, which you were planning on going to include anyways in your ideal sketch of the game. And you keep going. You're like, all right, so I added a race. We don't want to add another race. That'd be, silly. Let's add some more weapons, and we'll price that at 60,000. And eventually you hit 80,000. Potentially you go over, and if you don't hit it, you try to make do. But ultimately, you are underfunded, and if anything goes wrong, the game's going to fail, or it's going to be in terrible condition, which is another thing we've seen. Even Consortium was somewhat guilty of that, because I truly believe their first game was underfunded, and they ended up releasing it pretty buggy, but they worked really hard to correct that. And I know people will say, oh, they shouldn't have released it in that state anyways, blah, 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 which is very true. But if you see the typical reaction is to just completely abandon your game, you realize how sort of special that is. Alright, so this is enough rambling. Let's tie this in a bow, alright? The conclusion that I draw is that maybe Kickstarter, as sort of a generalized concept of this, is not the best place for mid-tier campaigns. Essentially, if you price your game above $100,000 and you don't have the established brand, you don't have the nostalgia benefit, you don't have the developer, you don't have the marketing, which you're not going to because you don't have any of those three other things, it doesn't seem like it's going to be worth your time to put this Kickstarter out there. And in fact, asking for $80,000 when you really need $200,000 is sort of poisonous to this whole concept. But I do truly believe there is a place out there for these games, or at least I really do hope there is, because I'm a true believer of the concept of these Kickstarters, of being able to fund these amazing concepts and games without a publisher or without investors, or without the typical investors, I should say. So the question now is, does that place actually exist currently? The developers of Consortium seem to think that answer is Fig. When their sequel Kickstarter failed, they released an announcement that they will be shortly going to Fig, very shortly after this video is released at the end of March. I'm not going to get into Fig too much now. I don't know enough about it to really talk about it with any sort of expertise. I've never participated in it or anything beyond knowing what it is. It does seem to suggest, but it remains to be seen if it will be successful to any degree. And maybe once we see what happens with Consortium, I'll revisit the subject and kind of go deeper into what Fig is and how it differs from Kickstarter, because it is really different from Kickstarter. At the very least, even though it doesn't seem like there's much to be optimistic in the form of mid-tier Kickstarter campaigns, at least there's something out there giving us hope that these type of games have a place to succeed. Thanks everybody for joining me for my very first Revamble. I'm very excited about this. I hope you've enjoyed it. Don't take anything I said here too seriously, but if you'd like to discuss it more, I will be happy to do so with you. I have a lot of ideas for future Revambles on other topics, and we'll just see how it goes. I'm going to play around with all the lighting and all this other junk. I'm very new to this. I have no idea what I'm doing. It's just something fun to do. I will see you next time. Bye.